Sarah Martinez had always been invisible. At 32, she had perfected the art of blending into the background, moving through life like a shadow that nobody noticed. Her small frame, quiet voice, and tendency to keep her head down had made her practically transparent to the world around her. She worked as a janitor at the prestigious Arlington Memorial Hospital, one of the most respected medical facilities in Washington, D.C., where politicians, diplomats, and high-ranking military officers received treatment. Every morning at 4:30 a.m., Sarah would arrive at the hospital through the service entrance, her worn sneakers making barely a whisper against the polished floors. She carried with her an old canvas bag containing her meager lunch, a thermos of coffee that had to last her entire 12-hour shift, and a small notebook where she wrote down reminders and observations that nobody else seemed to care about. The other staff members rarely acknowledged her presence, treating her as just another piece of equipment necessary for the hospital's operation. The doctors swept past her without a second glance, their expensive shoes clicking importantly on the floor she had just mopped. Nurses chatted among themselves, discussing their weekend plans and family dramas, never including Sarah in their conversations even when she was cleaning nearby. Administrative staff looked through her as if she were made of glass, occasionally pointing out missed spots or complaining about her work to her supervisor, but never addressing her directly. Sarah's supervisor, Mrs. Henderson, was a stern woman in her 50s who treated the cleaning staff like unwelcome intruders in her pristine hospital. She would follow Sarah around during random inspections, running her finger along windowsills and baseboards, searching for any speck of dust or streak on the glass. When she found something amiss, which she invariably did, Mrs. Henderson would sigh dramatically and make notes on her clipboard, shaking her head as if Sarah's very existence was a personal disappointment. The work itself was backbreaking. Sarah's day began in the basement, where she would gather her supplies and check the assignment board to see which floors and departments needed her attention. She would spend hours on her hands and knees, scrubbing floors that thousands of people walked across daily. Her knees had developed permanent bruises from the concrete and tile, and her hands were perpetually red and cracked from the harsh cleaning chemicals, despite the thin rubber gloves that barely provided protection. But Sarah found purpose in her work that others couldn't understand. She took pride in ensuring that the operating rooms were spotless for surgeries, knowing that her attention to detail might play a small role in saving someone's life. She carefully disinfected patient rooms, thinking about the families who would visit their loved ones and hoping to provide them with a clean, comfortable environment during difficult times. When she cleaned the waiting areas, she imagined anxious relatives finding some small comfort in the pristine surroundings. The patients themselves rarely noticed her either. She had become skilled at timing her work to avoid disrupting their rest or medical procedures, slipping in and out of rooms like a gentle breeze. Occasionally, an elderly patient would nod at her or mumble a quiet thank you, but most were too absorbed in their own pain and worried to acknowledge the woman who ensured their surroundings remained hygienic and welcoming. Sarah lived alone in a tiny studio apartment 15 minutes away from the hospital, in a neighborhood that had seen better days. Her apartment was immaculately clean, reflecting the same attention to detail she brought to her work. She had few possessions, but everything had its place. A small bookshelf held volumes of poetry and biographies that she checked out from the local library, her only form of entertainment. She particularly enjoyed reading about historical figures who had overcome adversity, finding inspiration in their stories of perseverance. Her family had been gone for over a decade now. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was 21, leaving her to care for her younger brother Miguel, who had been serving in the army. Miguel had been her world, the only person who truly saw and valued her. He would call her every week from whatever base he was stationed at, sharing stories of his fellow soldiers and his dreams of making a career in the military. Sarah had worked 3 jobs to support herself and send him care packages, proud of his dedication and service to his country. The day that changed everything started like any other Tuesday morning. Sarah arrived at the hospital before dawn, the autumn air crisp and carrying the scent of fallen leaves. She badged in through the service entrance and made her way to the supply closet, gathering her cart and beginning her routine. The hospital was quieter in the early morning hours, with only the night shift staff and emergency personnel moving through the hallways. As she worked her way through the cardiac unit, Sarah noticed increased activity around one of the private suites. Security personnel stood at attention outside the door, and she could see additional medical equipment being wheeled into the room. She had learned over the years that certain patients required extra discretion and security, usually high-ranking officials or celebrities who needed to maintain their privacy while receiving treatment. Dr. Williams, the chief of cardiology, emerged from the room looking exhausted and concerned. Sarah had observed him over the years, noting how he carried the weight of his patients' lives on his shoulders. He was one of the few staff members who occasionally acknowledged her with a brief nod, though they had never actually spoken. Today, he looked particularly stressed, running his hand through his graying hair and speaking in hushed, urgent tones with the nurses. Sarah continued her work, carefully cleaning around the increased foot traffic while staying out of everyone's way. She had developed an almost supernatural ability to make herself invisible during these high-security situations, understanding that her job was to maintain cleanliness without interfering with the important work happening around her. She noticed everything, though, the worried expressions, the frequent consultations between specialists, and the way the security detail seemed to be preparing for something significant. During her lunch break, Sarah sat alone in the staff cafeteria as usual, eating the peanut butter sandwich she had packed and reading a few pages of a biography about Eleanor Roosevelt. The other employees sat in their usual cliques, discussing hospital gossip and their personal lives. Sarah had long ago stopped trying to join their conversations, accepting her role as an observer rather than a participant in the social fabric of the workplace. As she prepared to return to work, Sarah overheard fragments of conversation from a nearby table where several nurses were speaking in low voices. They mentioned something about the general and how critical his condition was, but she couldn't make out the details. Sarah had learned that the hospital occasionally treated high-ranking military officers, given its proximity to the Pentagon and other government facilities, but she had never encountered one personally. The afternoon brought an unusual level of activity to the hospital. Sarah noticed more security personnel arriving, and several areas were cordoned off from general access. She adjusted her cleaning schedule accordingly, focusing on areas that wouldn't interfere with whatever important situation was developing. Her supervisor, Mrs. Henderson, was even more agitated than usual, barking orders at the cleaning staff and demanding that everything be absolutely perfect for what she cryptically referred to as very important visitors. As evening approached, Sarah was cleaning the main lobby when she noticed a convoy of black SUVs pulling up to the hospital's main entrance. Military personnel in dress uniforms emerged from the vehicles, followed by what appeared to be high-ranking officers. The hospital's administration staff hurried to greet them, their usual composed demeanor replaced by obvious nervousness and deference. Sarah continued her work, methodically cleaning the large windows that offered a view of the entrance area. She watched as the military officials were escorted through the lobby, their polished boots clicking sharply against the floor she had spent hours perfecting. None of them looked in her direction, of course. She was just part of the hospital's infrastructure, as invisible and unremarkable as the walls themselves. But something about the scene stirred a memory deep within Sarah's heart. The sight of the military uniforms, the serious expressions, and the sense of honor and duty that seemed to emanate from these officers reminded her of Miguel. He had looked so proud in his uniform during his last visit home, standing tall and speaking passionately about his service and his fellow soldiers. Sarah felt a familiar pang of loss and pride, emotions that she kept carefully locked away most of the time. As her shift neared its end, Sarah made her final rounds through the hospital, ensuring that everything was clean and ready for the night shift. She had learned to take satisfaction in these small accomplishments, knowing that her work mattered even if nobody else seemed to notice or appreciate it. Tomorrow would bring another day of invisible service, another opportunity to contribute to the healing environment that the hospital provided to its patients. But, as Sarah prepared to leave that evening, she had no idea that the next morning would bring an encounter that would change not only her own life but also challenge everyone around her to reconsider what it truly meant to see and value another human being. The story of the overlooked janitor was about to become something extraordinary, something that would force an entire hospital to confront their assumptions about worth, dignity, and the hidden depths that exist within every person they had dismissed as insignificant. The next morning arrived with an unusual tension hanging over Arlington Memorial Hospital. Sarah could feel it the moment she stepped through the service entrance at her usual time of 4:30 a.m. The security presence had doubled overnight, and she noticed several military vehicles still parked in the visitor area. Whatever situation had begun yesterday was clearly far from over. As Sarah collected her cleaning supplies, she overheard two security guards discussing the increased protocols. They mentioned something about a code red situation and the need for absolute vigilance, but their conversation stopped abruptly when they noticed her presence. This was nothing new for Sarah. People often ceased their discussions when she appeared, as if a janitor couldn't be trusted with any information, no matter how mundane. The hospital felt different that morning. Staff members moved with more urgency, their usual casual conversations replaced by whispered exchanges and worried glances. Sarah began her rounds on the third floor, where she immediately noticed that the cardiac wing was completely restricted. Military personnel stood guard at both ends of the hallway, checking identification badges and maintaining a security perimeter that she had never seen before in her 8 years of working at the hospital. Dr. Williams emerged from the restricted area looking as though he hadn't slept all night. His usually pristine white coat was wrinkled, and his eyes held a weariness that spoke of critical decisions and life-or-death responsibilities. Sarah was mopping the hallway when he passed, and, for a brief moment, their eyes met. Instead of his usual distracted nod, Dr. Williams paused and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret, something between recognition and curiosity. "Excuse me," he said quietly, causing Sarah to freeze in surprise. In 8 years, Dr. Williams had never actually spoken to her directly. "You're here every morning, aren't you? Always before anyone else?" Sarah nodded, uncertain whether she was in trouble or if this was somehow related to the increased security. Her voice came out as barely a whisper when she replied, "Yes, sir. I start at 4:30. Dr. Williams studied her for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "Thank you for keeping everything so clean. It matters more than you might know." With that, he hurried away, leaving Sarah standing in the hallway with her mop, wondering what had prompted this unprecedented interaction. As the morning progressed, Sarah noticed that the hospital's atmosphere continued to grow more tense. She overheard snippets of conversations about a critical patient and international implications, but the details remained frustratingly elusive. What she did observe was an unprecedented level of preparation and attention to detail throughout the facility. Every surface was being inspected, every protocol was being double-checked, and every staff member seemed to be operating under an unusual degree of scrutiny. Mrs. Henderson appeared more frequently than usual, her clipboard in hand and her expression even more severe than normal. She followed Sarah through her rounds with increased intensity, checking her work with microscopic attention to detail. "Everything must be perfect today," she repeated multiple times, though she offered no explanation for why this particular day was different from any other. During her mid-morning break, Sarah retreated to a small utility room where she often went to escape the chaos of the hospital. It was a cramped space filled with extra supplies and cleaning equipment, but it offered her a few minutes of solitude in an otherwise overwhelming environment. As she sat on an overturned bucket, eating an apple from her lunch bag, Sarah reflected on the strange morning and Dr. Williams' unexpected words. She thought about Miguel and how proud he had been of his work in the army. He had often told her that service came in many forms, and that every person who contributed to something larger than themselves was worthy of respect and recognition. "It doesn't matter if you're a general or a cook in the mess hall," he had said during their last phone conversation. "What matters is that you do your job with honor and that you care about the people you're serving." The memory brought both comfort and pain to Sarah's heart. Miguel had been killed in action 3 years ago, struck by an improvised explosive device while on patrol in Afghanistan. The notification officers had come to her apartment on a rainy Thursday evening, their solemn faces and carefully rehearsed words forever burned into her memory. They had spoken of Miguel's bravery, his dedication to his fellow soldiers, and his love for his sister, but their words had felt hollow in the face of her devastating loss. Sarah returned to her work with renewed focus, channeling her grief into the meticulous attention to detail that had always characterized her approach to the job. She cleaned each surface as if Miguel might inspect it himself, maintaining the standards of excellence that he had always encouraged her to pursue. The hospital might not notice her individual contribution, but she knew that her brother would have been proud of her dedication and professionalism. The afternoon brought an escalation in the already heightened security measures. Sarah watched from a distance as several high-ranking military officials arrived at the hospital, their uniforms decorated with ribbons and insignia that she didn't recognize but that clearly commanded respect from everyone around them. The hospital's administrative staff seemed to be in a state of barely controlled panic, rushing to accommodate whatever requirements these important visitors had brought with them. As Sarah was cleaning the windows in the main lobby, she observed a particularly distinguished-looking officer speaking with the hospital director. The officer was tall and imposing, with silver hair and a bearing that suggested years of command responsibility. His uniform bore more decorations than Sarah had ever seen, and the way other military personnel deferred to him indicated that he held a position of significant authority. The conversation between the officer and the hospital director appeared tense, with both men speaking in urgent, hushed tones. Sarah couldn't hear their words, but she could see the stress in their body language and the way they repeatedly glanced toward the cardiac wing where the mysterious patient was being treated. Whatever was happening in that restricted area was clearly a matter of great importance to very powerful people. During her afternoon break, Sarah encountered Maria, one of the few hospital employees who had ever shown her genuine kindness. Maria worked in the kitchen and had occasionally shared a table with Sarah during lunch breaks, treating her with the basic human decency that was so rare in Sarah's daily experience. Today, Maria looked particularly troubled as she sat alone in the staff cafeteria. "Everything okay?" Sarah asked quietly, taking a seat across from Maria. Maria glanced around nervously before leaning forward and lowering her voice. "There's a patient in the cardiac unit, a very important military man. They say he's dying, and that if he doesn't make it..." She trailed off, shaking her head. "I don't understand all the politics, but apparently this man's death could cause serious problems. International problems." Sarah felt a chill run through her. The increased security, the worried expressions, the high-ranking officers, it all began to make sense. Someone critically important was fighting for his life just floors above where she worked, and the outcome of that battle could have consequences far beyond the hospital walls. "They've brought in specialists from all over the country," Maria continued. "The best cardiac surgeons, the most advanced equipment. But I heard Dr. Williams telling someone that it might not be enough. This man has been through so much, survived so many dangerous situations, and now..." She shrugged helplessly. As Sarah returned to work, she found herself thinking about the unknown patient in ways that surprised her. She didn't know who he was or what role he played in the larger world, but she understood the weight of responsibility that must rest on his shoulders. She thought about Miguel and his fellow soldiers, men and women who had dedicated their lives to serving something greater than themselves, often at enormous personal cost. The evening shift change brought another wave of activity to the hospital. Sarah watched as day shift nurses briefed their night shift replacements with unusual thoroughness, their faces grave and their voices filled with concern. The security personnel maintained their vigilant posts, and the restricted areas remained completely off limits to all but the most essential medical staff. As Sarah prepared to complete her shift, she made her usual final rounds through the hospital's public areas. The lobby was quieter now, with most of the day's visitors having departed, but the underlying tension remained palpable. She methodically cleaned each surface, arranged the furniture, and ensured that everything was ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. While she was emptying trash cans in a hallway near the cardiac unit, Sarah heard the sound of hurried footsteps and urgent voices. She glanced up to see Dr. Williams and several other medical professionals rushing toward the restricted area, their faces etched with worry and determination. Whatever crisis they were facing, it appeared to be reaching a critical point. Sarah finished her work and prepared to leave, but something made her hesitate at the service exit. She stood for a moment in the empty hallway, surrounded by the clean, quiet environment that she had helped to create and maintain. Tomorrow would bring another day of invisible service, another opportunity to contribute to the healing mission of the hospital. But tonight, she found herself offering a silent prayer for the unknown patient whose life hung in the balance somewhere above her. She thought about courage and service, about the visible and invisible ways that people contributed to the world around them. Miguel had taught her that heroism came in many forms, and that sometimes the most important work was done by people whose names would never be known or celebrated. As Sarah finally made her way home through the quiet streets, she had no idea that tomorrow would bring an encounter that would forever change her understanding of recognition, respect, and the hidden connections that bind us all together. Thursday morning dawned gray and somber, with heavy clouds hanging low over Washington, D.C. Sarah arrived at Arlington Memorial Hospital to find the atmosphere even more charged than the previous day. The security presence had increased again, and she noticed several news vans parked across the street from the hospital, their satellite dishes reaching toward the overcast sky like mechanical flowers seeking light. As Sarah made her way through the service entrance, she was stopped by a security guard she didn't recognize. He was younger than the usual hospital security staff, with the bearing and haircut that suggested military background. "I need to see your ID and search your bag," he said politely but firmly. This was unprecedented in Sarah's experience. She had never been subjected to a security search in her 8 years at the hospital. She handed over her employee badge with nervous fingers and opened her canvas bag to reveal her modest lunch, thermos of coffee, and small notebook. The guard examined everything carefully but respectfully, even thumbing through the pages of her notebook where she kept cleaning schedules and personal reminders. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, handing everything back to her. "I appreciate your patience. We have some very important people in the building today." Sarah nodded and continued to the supply area, her mind racing with questions about what could possibly require such extraordinary security measures. As she gathered her cleaning supplies, she overheard two hospital maintenance workers discussing the situation in hushed tones. "They say he's been unconscious for 2 days now," one of them whispered. "Multiple organ failure, they think. The doctors aren't sure he's going to make it through the day." "Who is he?" the other worker asked. "Some kind of war hero, I heard. Spent 30 years in the army, fought in every major conflict since Vietnam. The president himself called the hospital director yesterday." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. A career military man, someone who had dedicated his life to serving his country, just like Miguel. She found herself thinking about all the soldiers she had never met, all the men and women who had served alongside her brother, and wondering if this unknown patient might have been one of them. Her work that morning took on a different quality, infused with a sense of purpose that went beyond her usual professional dedication. As she cleaned the floors and surfaces throughout the hospital, Sarah found herself thinking about the healing environment she was helping to maintain. Perhaps her work was playing a small role in the care of someone who had sacrificed everything for his country, just as Miguel had done. The third floor remained completely restricted, with military guards posted at every entrance to the cardiac wing. Sarah adapted her cleaning schedule to avoid the secured areas, but she couldn't help noticing the constant flow of medical specialists and military officials who moved through the restricted corridors with grim expressions and urgent purpose. Dr. Williams emerged from the cardiac wing around mid-morning, looking even more exhausted than the day before. He paused at a water fountain near where Sarah was working, drinking deeply and rubbing his tired eyes. When he noticed her nearby, he offered a weary but genuine smile. "Good morning," he said, surprising her once again with direct acknowledgement. "How long have you been working here?" 8 years, sir," Sarah replied, her voice barely audible. Dr. Williams nodded slowly. 8 years of early mornings and hard work. I appreciate that dedication, especially this week. Everything you do matters, even if people don't always remember to tell you." Before Sarah could respond, Dr. Williams was called back to the restricted area by a nurse who appeared in the hallway with an urgent expression. He hurried away, leaving Sarah with a warm feeling that she rarely experienced at work, the sense of being seen and valued by someone who mattered. The morning progressed with increasing tension throughout the hospital. Sarah noticed that several departments had been asked to postpone non-essential procedures, and the usual flow of routine patients seemed to have been redirected to other facilities. The entire hospital appeared to be operating in service of the critical situation unfolding in the cardiac wing. During her lunch break, Sarah sat alone in the staff cafeteria, but this time she wasn't entirely isolated. Maria approached her table carrying a cup of coffee and wearing an expression of barely contained anxiety. "Have you heard anything new?" Maria asked, settling into the chair across from Sarah. Sarah shook her head. Just that he's a military man, someone very important. They brought in a chaplain this morning, Maria whispered, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. And I saw them setting up additional equipment, the kind they use for. She didn't finish the sentence, but Sarah understood the implication. The thought of a chaplain made Sarah's chest tighten with memories of Miguel's funeral. She remembered the military chaplain who had spoken at the service, talking about honor and sacrifice and the debt that could never be repaid to those who gave everything for their country. She wondered if this unknown patient had a family somewhere, waiting for news and praying for a miracle that might not come. It's so sad, Maria continued. To survive everything he's been through, all the dangers of war and combat, only to end up fighting for his life in a hospital bed. Makes you think about how fragile life really is. Sarah nodded, thinking about the randomness of fate and the way that courage and dedication didn't always protect people from life's ultimate vulnerabilities. She finished her simple lunch and returned to work with a heavy heart, carrying with her the weight of thoughts about mortality, service, and the invisible connections that bound together all people who understood the meaning of sacrifice. The afternoon brought a new development that sent ripples of activity throughout the hospital. Sarah was cleaning windows in the main lobby when she observed the arrival of what appeared to be the most senior military official yet. His vehicle was different from the others, a larger, more imposing SUV with additional security escorts. When he stepped out, every military person in sight snapped to attention with a precision that spoke of ingrained respect and protocol. This officer was older than the others Sarah had seen, with completely silver hair and a bearing that suggested decades of command responsibility. His uniform was immaculate, adorned with ribbons and insignia that clearly indicated the highest levels of military achievement. The way other senior officers deferred to him, stepping aside and waiting for his acknowledgement, made it clear that he held extraordinary authority within the military hierarchy. The hospital director personally greeted this distinguished visitor, accompanied by what appeared to be the entire senior medical staff. Their conversation was brief and intense, conducted in voices too low for Sarah to overhear from her position at the windows. After a few minutes, the group moved toward the elevators that would carry them to the restricted cardiac wing. Sarah continued her work, but she found herself deeply affected by the gravity and dignity that this latest arrival had brought to the hospital. There was something about his presence that spoke of a lifetime dedicated to service, of decisions made under impossible circumstances, and of responsibility for the lives and welfare of others. She thought about Miguel's descriptions of his commanding officers, men and women who carried the weight of their soldiers' safety and well-being every moment of every day. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah became aware of increased activity around the cardiac wing. Medical staff moved with renewed urgency, and additional equipment was transported to the restricted area. She overheard fragments of conversations about last-ditch efforts and experimental procedures, words that suggested a desperate battle being fought against overwhelming odds. The emotional weight of the situation began to affect Sarah more deeply than she had expected. This unknown patient had become, in her mind, a symbol of all the military men and women who had served with Miguel, all the soldiers whose sacrifices had protected the freedoms that most people took for granted. She found herself working with even greater attention to detail, as if her dedication to cleanliness and order could somehow contribute to the healing process taking place floors above. During her final rounds of the day, Sarah encountered Dr. Williams once more as he stood alone in a hallway, staring out a window at the gray afternoon sky. His shoulders were slumped with exhaustion and what appeared to be defeat. When he noticed her approach, he turned with a sad smile. "Some battles can't be won with medicine," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "Sometimes all the skill and technology in the world isn't enough to overcome what the human body has endured." Sarah wanted to say something comforting, something that might acknowledge the tremendous effort he had been making, but words seemed inadequate. Instead, she simply nodded with understanding, offering the silent support that came naturally to someone who had experienced profound loss. "He's been unconscious for 3 days now," Dr. Williams continued, his professional composure cracking slightly. "General Harrison, 32 years of service to his country. Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan. He survived everything the world could throw at him, and now." He shook his head slowly. General Harrison. Finally, Sarah had a name to attach to the mysterious patient who had commanded so much attention and concern. She thought about Miguel's stories of the generals and senior officers he had encountered during his service, men and women who had earned their rank through decades of dedication and leadership. General Harrison was probably someone who had influenced the lives and careers of thousands of soldiers, someone whose decisions had shaped military strategy and whose leadership had saved countless lives. As Sarah completed her shift and prepared to leave, she found herself deeply moved by the human drama unfolding in the cardiac wing. Tomorrow would bring either a miracle or a tragedy, either a celebration of medical triumph or a solemn acknowledgement of mortality. She had played only the smallest role in the support system that surrounded General Harrison's fight for life, but she felt honored to have contributed in whatever way she could. Walking through the quiet evening streets toward her small apartment, Sarah reflected on the hidden stories that surrounded every person, the depths of experience and sacrifice that often remained invisible to casual observers. She had no idea that tomorrow would bring an encounter that would finally make her own story visible, revealing connections and recognition that would change not only her life but the lives of everyone around her. Friday morning arrived with an unexpected break in the weather. Sunlight streamed through the clouds for the first time in days, casting golden rays across the hospital parking lot as Sarah made her way to the service entrance. The news vans were still positioned across the street, their crews preparing for what many expected would be a somber announcement about General Harrison's condition. Sarah passed through the now familiar security checkpoint, submitting to the bag search that had become routine over the past few days. The young military guard who checked her identification seemed more subdued than usual, his professional demeanor tinged with sadness that reflected the general mood throughout the hospital. "Any word about the general?" Sarah found herself asking, surprising both the guard and herself with her boldness. The guard looked at her for a moment, perhaps seeing something in her expression that prompted him to respond. "He made it through the night," he said quietly. "That's something, at least. The doctors are cautiously optimistic." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her as she made her way to collect her cleaning supplies. The news that General Harrison had survived another night felt like a small victory against the overwhelming forces that had been aligned against him. She began her morning rounds with renewed energy, channeling her optimism into the meticulous attention to cleanliness that had always characterized her work. The hospital atmosphere seemed lighter that morning, as if the staff could sense that the crisis might be beginning to turn. Sarah noticed that the medical personnel moving through the corridors carried themselves with less of the desperate urgency that had marked the previous days. There was still concern and vigilance, but the air of impending tragedy had lifted slightly. Dr. Williams appeared in better spirits when Sarah encountered him during her rounds on the second floor. He was speaking with a colleague about encouraging signs and possible stabilization, terms that suggested the general's condition might be improving. When he noticed Sarah nearby, he paused in his conversation to offer her a genuine smile. "Good morning," he said warmly. "I have some better news today. Our patient is showing signs of improvement. Still critical, but better than yesterday." "I'm glad to hear that, sir," Sarah replied, meaning it deeply. Dr. Williams studied her for a moment, noting the genuine concern in her voice. "You know, I've been thinking about our conversations this week. You care about people, don't you? Even people you've never met." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. She thought about Miguel and all the soldiers she would never know, all the men and women who had dedicated their lives to service and protection. "That's a rare quality," Dr. Williams continued. "Caring about others just because they're human beings, not because of who they are or what they can do for you. General Harrison would appreciate that kind of concern." As Dr. Williams walked away, Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest. It was perhaps the first time in years that someone had recognized and valued her capacity for empathy and concern. She had always carried a deep well of compassion for others, but it was a part of herself that rarely found expression in her daily interactions at the hospital. The morning progressed with continued signs that General Harrison's condition was stabilizing. Sarah noticed that the frantic activity around the cardiac wing had calmed to a more measured pace, with medical staff moving with purpose but not panic. The security presence remained substantial, but even the guards seemed more relaxed, as if they could sense that the immediate crisis had passed. During her mid-morning break, Sarah retreated to her usual quiet utility room to eat an apple and read a few pages of her current library book. Today she was reading a biography of Clara Barton, the Civil War nurse who had founded the American Red Cross. The parallels between Barton's dedication to caring for soldiers and her own small role in maintaining a healing environment for General Harrison struck her as she read about Barton's tireless work on behalf of wounded warriors. As Sarah was preparing to return to work, she heard footsteps in the hallway outside the utility room. The footsteps stopped, and she heard a voice she recognized, the distinguished senior military officer who had arrived the previous afternoon. He was speaking to someone in low, urgent tones. "The doctors say he's going to make it," the voice said with obvious relief. "Touch and go for a while there, but William Harrison is too stubborn to give up. 32 years of military service, and he's not ready to surrender to a heart attack." "Thank God," another voice replied. The implications if we had lost him, his knowledge, his experience, his relationships with foreign military leaders. It would have been devastating. "He's been asking for updates on his men," the first voice continued. "Even while he's been unconscious, apparently he's been worrying about the soldiers under his command. That's William for you, always putting his people first." Sarah felt her eyes fill with tears as she listened to this description of General Harrison. He sounded exactly like the kind of leader that Miguel had always admired and aspired to become, someone who placed the welfare of his soldiers above his own concerns, even while fighting for his life in a hospital bed. The voices moved away down the hallway, and Sarah emerged from the utility room with a renewed sense of connection to the drama that had been unfolding around her. General Harrison wasn't just a high-ranking official or an important political figure, he was a leader who cared deeply about the men and women under his command, the kind of person who had probably influenced the lives and careers of soldiers like Miguel. The afternoon brought the most positive developments yet. Sarah was cleaning the main lobby when she observed Dr. Williams speaking with the hospital director and several of the military officials who had been maintaining vigil at the hospital. Their body language and expressions suggested good news, and she could see smiles and handshakes being exchanged for the first time since the crisis had begun. Word spread quickly through the hospital that General Harrison had regained consciousness and was responding well to treatment. The atmosphere throughout the facility shifted dramatically, with staff members who had been carrying